There are winters that test the limits of human endurance, and then there are winters that rewrite what we thought possible to survive. The winter of 1832 to 1833 stands as perhaps the most brutal season ever recorded in the annals of the American fur trade. It arrived without warning across the Rocky Mountains, transforming familiar valleys into frozen graveyards and turning experienced trappers into desperate refugees fleeing for their lives. This wasn't merely cold weather. This was something different, something that seemed to reach into the very bones of the landscape itself. Temperatures plummeted to levels that froze mercury solid in thermometers. Rivers that had flowed for millennia locked beneath ice so thick that men could walk their horses across them. And in the high country, where the mountain men made their living pursuing beaver pelts, the snow fell in quantities that defied description, burying entire camps and obliterating trails that had guided trappers for generations. Tonight, we journey back to that terrible season, to understand not just how cold it became, but what happened to the men who found themselves caught in its grip, far from civilization, with nothing but their wits and their will to survive. Before we can understand the catastrophe that befell these men, we must first understand who they were and the world they inhabited. The mountain men of the early 1830s represented a unique breed of American frontiersmen, individuals who had deliberately chosen to leave behind the relative safety of settled territories to pursue fortunes in the wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. These were not aimless wanderers. The fur trade, particularly beaver pelts, represented serious business in the 1830s. Beaver fur was transformed into felt for top hats, which had become the height of European and American fashion. A single quality pelt could fetch several dollars, and a successful trapper might harvest hundreds in a season. For men willing to endure hardship and isolation, the mountains offered the possibility of wealth that would take years to accumulate through farming or labor back east. The typical mountain man lived a life that would seem unimaginable to us today. For most of the year, he traveled alone or in small groups, following the waterways where beaver built their dams. He might not see a settlement for 8 or 9 months at a stretch. His survival depended on an intricate knowledge of the land, the ability to read weather signs, and an understanding of which plants could sustain him and which would kill him. He needed to know how to treat wounds without a doctor, how to navigate without compasses through mountain ranges that could disorient even experienced travelers, and how to maintain his equipment with only the materials he could carry or fashion from the wilderness itself. These men developed a culture distinctly their own. Many took Native American wives, learning indigenous languages and adopting survival techniques that had sustained people in these mountains for thousands of years. They learned to make moccasins that could withstand rocky terrain, to construct shelters that would shed snow without collapsing, and to read the behavior of animals as indicators of coming weather. They told stories around campfires, exaggerating their exploits and adventures, creating a mythology that would later capture the American imagination. By 1832, the fur trade had become increasingly organized. Large companies like the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and the American Fur Company competed for territory and trappers. They established annual rendezvous sites where mountain men would gather each summer to sell their furs, resupply, and spend weeks in celebration before returning to their solitary pursuits. These gatherings became legendary for their excess, with men gambling away entire seasons of earnings, engaging in contests of strength and skill, and drinking themselves into oblivion after months of sobriety in the mountains. Yet, for all their skills and preparations, these men remained vulnerable to forces beyond their control. They understood that winters in the Rockies were harsh. They had experienced deep snows and bitter cold before. They knew men who had frozen to death or starved when game disappeared. But the winter that approached in 1832 would prove to be something entirely different, something that would challenge even the most experienced mountain man's ability to survive. The men heading into the high country that autumn had no way of knowing they were walking into a meteorological catastrophe that would claim dozens of lives and traumatize an entire generation of frontiersmen. Autumn in the Rocky Mountains typically arrives with a clarity that allows trappers to make their final preparations before winter's onset. The aspen leaves turn brilliant gold against the dark green of the pines. Elk bugle in the high meadows, and the air carries a crispness that invigorates rather than threatens. Experienced mountain men knew to watch for certain signs: when the geese departed, when the bears began seeking their dens, when the squirrels increased their frantic gathering of pine nuts. These natural indicators had guided survival in these mountains for generations. The autumn of 1832 began normally enough. Trappers who had gathered at the summer rendezvous along the Green River dispersed to their chosen territories, their pack animals laden with supplies intended to last until the following spring. Some headed north toward the Yellowstone country. Others struck west toward the Snake River valleys. Small brigades moved south along the various tributaries of the Colorado. Each man or group carried similar supplies: traps, ammunition, salt, perhaps some flour and coffee if they had done well the previous season, and the essential tools of their trade. But as September progressed, those paying attention began to notice anomalies. The first snows arrived earlier than usual, dusting the highest peaks while the valleys still enjoyed mild weather. Unusual numbers of animals seemed to be migrating to lower elevations. Birds that normally lingered into October departed in large flocks. Some of the older trappers, men who had spent decades in the mountains, felt a vague unease they couldn't quite articulate. Something in the quality of the air, perhaps, or the behavior of the wildlife suggested that this winter might prove different. By early October, light snows were falling regularly in the high country. This wasn't unprecedented, but the consistency troubled experienced men. Typically, early autumn snows would melt between storms, allowing animals to continue foraging and trappers to move between camps. This year, each snowfall seemed to persist, building incrementally on what had come before. The ground never entirely cleared. Mountain streams that normally flowed freely into November began developing ice along their margins. The real shift came in late October. A massive storm system moved down from the north, bringing with it a cold that felt fundamentally different from normal mountain winters. Temperatures dropped precipitously, and the snow that fell came in quantities that veteran trappers had never witnessed so early in the season. In some locations, 3 feet of snow fell in less than 2 days. The storm was followed not by the usual clearing, but by another system, and then another. Within 2 weeks, many high-altitude camps found themselves under 6 or 7 feet of snow, with more falling daily. For trappers scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness, these conditions created immediate problems. The deep snow made travel exhausting and dangerous. Horses and mules struggled through drifts, burning energy faster than they could replace it with the sparse forage beneath the snow. Trap lines became inaccessible. Small game disappeared, presumably into burrows and dens where they would wait out the weather. The larger animals that trappers depended on for food began descending to lower elevations, leaving the high country devoid of sustenance. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that began to dawn on these isolated men: this was not a temporary rough patch that would break in a few days. This was the beginning of something sustained, something that might last for months, and they were caught in exposed positions with finite supplies and no way to summon help. The decisions made in those early November days would determine who survived and who would become another statistic in the deadly arithmetic of frontier life. When we speak of cold today, we mean reaching for an extra blanket or turning up the thermostat. The cold that descended upon the Rocky Mountains in late 1832 represented something entirely different. This was cold that shattered iron tools. Cold that caused trees to explode with sounds like gunshots as their sap froze and expanded. Cold that transformed human breath into ice crystals that hung in the air, creating a phenomenon the trappers called diamond dust. The mercury in thermometers froze solid, which occurs at approximately 40 degrees below zero on the Fahrenheit scale. But even this gave no true measure of the cold, because the temperatures continued to drop beyond what those instruments could record. Trappers who kept journals noted that whiskey, which they knew froze around 5 degrees, had become solid in their canteens. water thrown into the air would crystallize before hitting the ground. Lead balls from muskets became brittle and would shatter rather than mushroom upon impact. The human body is remarkably adaptable, but it has limits. At extreme temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Fingers and toes, with their limited blood flow, are typically first to suffer frostbite. The tissue crystallizes, ice forming between and within cells, causing damage that cannot be repaired. In the early stages, frostbitten flesh turns white and numb. As it thaws, if it thaws, it becomes purple and swollen, filled with fluid. In severe cases, the tissue dies, turning black and eventually falling away. Many trappers that winter would emerge in the spring missing fingers, toes, or entire hands and feet sacrificed to the cold. But frostbite represented only the most visible danger. Hypothermia presented a more insidious threat. As core body temperature drops, the body begins to shut down non-essential systems to preserve the vital organs. Shivering intensifies at first, the body's attempt to generate heat through muscle activity. But as temperature continues to fall, shivering stops. The victim becomes confused, unable to make rational decisions. Speech becomes slurred. Movements turn clumsy. In the final stages, victims often experience what's called paradoxical undressing, removing their clothes in the delusion that they're overheating, sealing their fate. The mountain men fought this enemy with every tool at their disposal. Fire became the center of existence. Men would spend hours gathering fuel, dragging dead wood through deep snow, breaking branches with numb hands, anything to keep the flames burning through the endless nights. They learned to build fires against cliff faces or large rocks that would absorb and reflect heat. They constructed windbreaks from pine boughs and snow. They huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat without shame or embarrassment, understanding that survival trumped dignity. Clothing became crucial. A mountain man's typical outfit consisted of buckskin shirt and leggings, a wool blanket or buffalo robe, and moccasins. In normal winters, this sufficed with the addition of a fur cap and gloves. But this winter demanded more. Men wrapped their feet in strips of blanket before putting on their moccasins. They fashioned face coverings from any available cloth to protect against windban and frostbite. They learned to keep their clothing loose rather than tight, as trapped air provided insulation. Those who had traded for buffalo robes from the Indians counted themselves fortunate. Nothing else matched buffalo hide for warmth and wind resistance. Sleep presented its own challenges. A man could not simply lie down and rest when temperatures dropped to these extremes. Fires had to be maintained throughout the night, requiring someone to wake every hour or two to add fuel. Those sleeping had to avoid contact with the frozen ground, which would draw heat from their bodies. They piled pine needles and boughs beneath their sleeping robes, creating insulation between themselves and the lethal cold radiating up from the earth. Even so, men would wake in the morning to find their breath had frozen on their beards and mustaches, coating their faces in ice. Cold alone might not have killed as many as it did. The mountain men were tough, resourceful individuals who had weathered harsh conditions before. But the combination of extreme cold with the complete disappearance of game created a crisis that would push men to the absolute limits of human endurance and beyond. Beaver, the primary target of the trappers' efforts, became irrelevant when the streams froze solid and travel to trap lines became impossible. But beaver meat had never been the primary food source anyway. The mountain men depended on larger game, elk, deer, mountain sheep, and occasionally buffalo in the lower valleys. These animals provided not just sustenance but also the raw materials for survival. Hides became clothing and shelter. Bones and antlers could be fashioned into tools. Sinews served as cordage. A successful hunt meant weeks of security. The absence of game meant death was merely a matter of time. As the early snows piled deeper, the large game animals descended to lower elevations, following patterns evolved over millennia to avoid the worst of winter conditions. They sought south-facing slopes where wind kept some areas relatively clear of snow, allowing access to dried grasses. They moved to dense timber where tree canopies intercepted some of the snowfall. They gathered in wintering areas their species had used for countless generations. And in doing so, they left the high country trapping areas empty of life. For the trappers, this created an impossible situation. Following the game to lower elevations meant abandoning their camps, their cache supplies, and their investment in trap lines and equipment. It meant traveling through deep snow on weakened horses or on foot, burning precious calories with no guarantee of finding game at the end of the journey. It meant potentially walking into territory claimed by competing trappers or Indian tribes who might not welcome strangers competing for increasingly scarce resources. Many chose to stay in their established camps, gambling that the weather would break and game would return. For most, this gamble proved fatal. The progression of starvation follows a predictable and horrifying pattern. The body first burns through readily available carbohydrates, then begins breaking down fat stores for energy. Once fat reserves are depleted, the body turns on itself, consuming muscle tissue. The victim grows progressively weaker, unable to perform even simple tasks. The mind becomes clouded, decision-making impaired. Wounds cease to heal. The immune system fails, leaving the victim vulnerable to infections that would normally be minor. In the final stages, the body begins cannibalizing organs, and death arrives with a terrible inevitability. Mountain men in their desperate camps tried everything to stave off starvation. They boiled their leather clothing and equipment, creating a foul but technically nutritious soup from the rawhide. Belts, moccasins, saddles, anything made of hide went into the pot. Some turned to eating the inner bark of certain trees, a technique learned from Indians, which provided minimal nutrition but at least gave the stomach something to process. Others set snares for small animals, though the deep snow made this largely futile. A few lucky individuals managed to kill a horse or mule, rationing the meat carefully, knowing it represented perhaps their last substantial meal. The psychological toll of starvation may have been worse than the physical suffering. These were men who had always provided for themselves, who took pride in their self-sufficiency and wilderness skills. To find themselves helpless, trapped by conditions beyond their control, watching their bodies waste away, must have been psychologically devastating. Journal entries from those who survived describe a creeping despair, a sense that the mountains they had loved and mastered were now killing them with casual indifference. Some men simply gave up, ceasing to fight, accepting what seemed inevitable. Others maintained hope against all reason, and sometimes that irrational hope was enough to carry them through until conditions improved. The geography of the Rocky Mountains and the scattered nature of the fur trade meant that disaster struck simultaneously across hundreds of miles of wilderness, with most victims completely unaware that others faced similar circumstances. A trapping party in what is now Wyoming had no way of knowing that their counterparts in Montana or Idaho were freezing and starving just as they were. This isolation transformed a regional catastrophe into dozens of individual struggles, each playing out in the vast silence of the winter wilderness. Some groups fared better than others through a combination of luck, location, and leadership. A brigade led by a veteran mountain man named Thomas, Broken Hand, Fitzpatrick managed to survive relatively intact, though not without losses. Fitzpatrick had chosen to winter in the Bear River Valley, somewhat lower in elevation than many trappers preferred but offering better protection from the worst weather. When the early snows arrived, he made the crucial decision to sacrifice their beaver harvest, abandoning their trap lines and focusing entirely on survival. They hunted aggressively while game was still accessible, jerking huge quantities of meat. They constructed substantial shelters rather than the minimal camps typical of trappers who planned to move frequently. These decisions, made early when conditions first turned severe, gave them a margin of survival that other groups lacked. Other parties were not so fortunate. A group of 7 men trapping along the Salmon River in what is now central Idaho found themselves completely snowbound by mid-November. Their camp, situated in a high mountain valley that had provided excellent trapping the previous autumn, became a death trap. The snow accumulated to depths exceeding 15 feet in some locations. Travel became impossible. Game vanished. By December, they were eating their horses. By January, they were reduced to boiling hides. When spring finally arrived, other trappers passing through the area found 4 bodies in the remains of the camp, frozen in positions that suggested death had come slowly. The fate of the other 3 men remains unknown. They presumably attempted to walk out and died somewhere in the wilderness, their bodies lost beneath the snow. As winter dragged on and some groups began to realize the scope of the disaster, there were attempts at rescue. Trappers at lower elevations, while facing their own challenges, were not as severely impacted as those caught in the high country. Some organized expeditions to reach camps where they knew men were isolated. These rescue attempts, undertaken with the best of intentions, often ended in tragedy. One particularly notable rescue effort was mounted in February by a group of 5 trappers who set out from a trading post near the Great Salt Lake with the intention of reaching several known camps in the mountains to the north. They carried what supplies they could manage, though travel through deep snows severely limited what they could transport. They made it perhaps 40 miles into the mountains before conditions forced them to turn back. 2 of the 5 suffered severe frostbite and would later lose toes. They had not reached any of the camps they intended to help. The men they sought to rescue either made it out on their own or died where they were trapped. The isolation also meant that many deaths went unrecorded. The annual fur trade rendezvous brought together most of the active trappers each summer, creating a rough census of who was working which territories. When men failed to appear at rendezvous, they were presumed dead, but the circumstances often remained mysterious. Had they frozen? Starved? Been killed by Indians or rival trappers? Drowned? Simply decided to quit the mountains and return to civilization? Without bodies or witnesses, questions remained unanswered. Years later, occasional discoveries of weathered bones or remnants of camps provided grim confirmations that filled in pieces of the puzzle, but many men who went into the mountains in the autumn of 1832 simply vanished from history, their stories lost. In the history of human survival, certain lines are crossed only under the most extreme duress. The winter of 1832 to 1833 pushed some mountain men beyond those lines, into territory that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Cannibalism, that most forbidden of acts, occurred in at least a few documented cases and likely in others that were never admitted or recorded. The most well-documented case involved a small party of 4 trappers working the upper reaches of the Snake River. Caught by the early snows and unable to escape to lower elevations, they quickly depleted their supplies and found no game. They killed their 2 horses in November, rationing the meat as carefully as possible. They ate their leather equipment. They subsisted for a time on pine bark soup. By late December, one of the men died, though whether from starvation, cold, or a combination is unclear. His 3 companions, having not eaten substantial food in weeks, facing certain death themselves, made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. They consumed their dead companion's body. Not immediately, and not without agonized debate. But survival instinct eventually overcame moral prohibition. They rationalized, perhaps, that the man was already dead, that his body could save 3 lives, that he would have understood under the circumstances. We cannot know their exact thoughts, only that they did it. One of the 3 would later provide a minimal account to another mountain man, speaking of it only once and never again. The confession ensured the story entered the oral history of the fur trade, though the names were mercifully omitted from most retellings. This was not the only instance. Rumors circulated for years afterward of other cases, whispered around campfires, never quite confirmed but never entirely dismissed. Trappers understood that men subjected to extreme starvation were capable of acts they would never contemplate under normal circumstances. There was a recognition that judgment should be reserved, that those who had not faced such extremity could not truly understand the choices involved. The psychological aftermath for survivors who crossed this line must have been profound. These were men who had grown up in Christian communities, taught that such acts were the ultimate sin, the mark of absolute depravity. To violate this most fundamental taboo meant carrying a burden of guilt and shame that no confession could fully relieve. Some likely never spoke of it to anyone, taking the secret to their graves. Others might have sought solace in the understanding of fellow survivors, though such conversations would have been rare and difficult. The mountain man culture, rough as it was, generally avoided direct judgment of survival choices. There was an understanding that the wilderness could place a man in situations where all options were terrible, where survival itself became morally complicated. Stories were told of earlier episodes in frontier history where cannibalism had occurred under desperate circumstances. The Donner Party disaster was still years in the future, but similar stories existed. The message was clear: the wilderness could break anyone, could force choices that civilization would condemn but the mountains would forgive. Still, the knowledge that such things had happened during that terrible winter cast a shadow over the fur trade's collective memory. It demonstrated how completely the weather had disrupted the normal patterns of mountain life. Experienced men, skilled survivors, had been reduced to extremes that few could imagine. The winter had stripped away not just lives but dignity, humanity itself in some cases. Those who survived intact, who managed to weather the conditions without crossing such lines, must have felt both fortunate and somehow guilty that they had been spared such choices. When spring finally came to the Rocky Mountains in 1833, it arrived tentatively, as if uncertain whether winter would permit its return. The first signs appeared in March, with daytime temperatures occasionally climbing above freezing at lower elevations. Icicles began to drip from rock faces. South-facing slopes developed bare patches where the wind had scoured away snow and the sun could reach the earth. These small changes meant little to the men still trapped in the high country, where snowpack remained measured in feet and temperatures continued to plunge at night. But gradually, inevitably, the season turned. April brought more consistent warmth. The snowpack began to settle and consolidate. Avalanches thundered down mountain faces as unstable accumulations finally gave way. Streams swelled with meltwater, breaking through the ice that had sealed them for months. Elk and deer began migrating back toward the high country, following the receding snow line to reach the fresh growth that would sustain them through the coming summer. For the trappers, spring meant both salvation and reckoning. Those who had survived could finally attempt to travel, to seek out other human beings, to reach supply points where food waited. But they emerged from their winter ordeals in shocking condition. Many could barely walk, weakened by months of inadequate nutrition. Frostbite injuries had become infected despite the cold that had initially prevented bacteria from flourishing. Men hobbled on feet that had lost toes to freezing. Others wrapped bandages around hands where fingers had blackened and been amputated with crude knives to prevent gangrene from spreading. The psychological state of the survivors was often as damaged as their physical condition. Months of isolation, facing death day after day, watching companions die, had left marks that would never entirely heal. Some men exhibited what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder: difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance, flashbacks to the worst moments of the winter, survivor's guilt that they had lived while others died. In an era that had no framework for understanding mental trauma, these symptoms were simply endured, rarely discussed, incorporated into the survivor's personality as best they could manage. As the scattered survivors began to regroup at lower elevations and eventually at the annual rendezvous, stories were shared and the scope of the disaster became clear. The casualty count varied depending on how it was tallied. At least 35 trappers were confirmed dead, their bodies found or their deaths witnessed by others. But the true number was almost certainly higher, perhaps significantly so. Men who had been working alone or in small groups, who had mentioned their intended trapping locations at the previous summer's rendezvous but never returned, were presumed dead but unconfirmed. Estimates ranged as high as 50 or 60 deaths directly attributable to the winter's conditions. The fur trade itself suffered a blow from which it would never entirely recover. The winter of 1832 to 1833 became a cautionary tale, a proof that the mountains could kill even the most experienced men, that skills and toughness sometimes weren't enough. Some survivors quit the trade entirely, returning to settlements and agricultural life, willing to accept poverty over risking another such winter. Others continued trapping, but with a new wariness, a recognition of their own vulnerability that changed how they approached the work. The companies that organized much of the fur trade also took note. They had lost substantial investments in men and equipment. They began implementing new policies, requiring trappers to winter in larger groups, establishing winter supply caches at strategic locations, even maintaining year-round trading posts at lower elevations where trappers could retreat if conditions became severe. These changes helped, though they also represented the beginning of the end for the truly independent mountain man, the solitary trapper who operated on his own terms. The rendezvous of 1833 was a somber affair, lacking the usual exuberance as survivors reunited and shared their experiences. There was drinking, certainly, and the usual trading and storytelling, but the shadow of the winter hung over everything. Toasts were raised to absent friends, their names spoken aloud so they would not be forgotten. And in the years that followed, the winter of 1832 to 1833 became a reference point, the standard against which all other winters were measured. The deadliest winter in mountain man history lasted only a few months, but its consequences rippled forward through time. The men who survived carried the scars, both physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. The stories they told influenced the next generation of trappers, teaching lessons bought with suffering about the importance of preparation, the need for caution, and the fundamental reality that humans survive in the wilderness only at nature's sufferance. We look back now from the comfort of heated homes and abundant food supplies, separated from these events by nearly 2 centuries of technological progress. It becomes easy to see these mountain men as figures from an impossibly distant past, people whose struggles have little relevance to our modern lives. But they were human beings, with hopes and fears and dreams much like our own. They felt cold as we do, hunger as we do, fear as we do. They wanted to live, to see another spring, to tell their stories to anyone who would listen. The mountains that killed them are still there, beautiful and terrible, capable of both nurturing and destroying those who venture into their high places. The winters still come, though we have largely insulated ourselves from their worst effects. But the story of that terrible season reminds us that we are not as separate from the natural world as we sometimes imagine, that the forces that shaped our ancestors' lives have not disappeared, merely retreated temporarily in the face of our technological defenses. Sleep well, knowing that the struggles of those long-dead trappers helped pave the way for the world we now inhabit, and that their stories, preserved in the fragmentary records of the frontier, still have something to teach us about endurance, survival, and the price that was paid to explore and settle this continent.